Howdy! In this mini lecture we will discuss environmental policy. The student learning objectives of this mini lecture are: characterize factors hindering environmental policy, identify the roles of branches of U.S. government in terms of environmental policy, characterize the three waves of U.S. environmental policy and the key characteristics of each wave, recognize major U.S. environmental laws. So why are there so many problems with environmental laws and regulations? Well, to begin, some feel the environmental regulations are too restrictive, bureaucratic, and expensive, or that they are an inconvenience. Another reason is because environmental problems by nature are complex and long-term, and trying to regulate them with laws is fraught with difficulty because human actions and thought processes are often short-term. In other words, many environmental problems are wicked problems. Yet another reason is that creating policy is just plain difficult because of the checks and balances that are built into a democratic system. There are, however, four very specific ways money influences policy in the United States. The first is campaign contributions. This is when individuals or corporations support a candidate by making monetary donations to the candidate's campaign. By law, corporations and industries are not allowed to make direct campaign contributions, but the loophole is that they can establish political action committees, also known as PACs, which raise money to help candidates win elections. The ultimate goal of PACs is to elect a candidate sensitive to their agenda and to have access to the candidate once they are elected. Thanks to the Supreme Court ruling in 2010 on this case, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, corporations and unions now exert more political influence than ever because they are now allowed to purchase political ads which support or oppose candidates. Vested interest is when people, organizations, industries, or corporations will benefit financially from a certain change in policy. For example, if a congressman owns stock in an oil company and that congressman introduces a bill for subsidies to that oil industry, then that congressman has a vested interest in the bill. Lobbying is when someone spends time or money trying to influence an elected official. Lobbying has evolved from average citizens to full-time professional lobbyists, which are employed by major businesses or organizations which want to push their agenda in the political arena. Unfortunately, environmental advocates are not the most powerful lobbyists, and they are often outspent by lobbyists for industries related to non-renewable resources. The term revolving door refers to when individuals move from the public to private sector, or vice versa, to gain a political advantage or financial advantage for an industry. For example, if a nuclear lobbyist is hired for a government job, that person now has an agenda they carry over from their days as a lobbyist for the industry they are now regulating as an elected official. Similarly, if an elected official leaves a public position to take a job in the industry they once regulated, the business that hired them will likely have political and financial advantages due to the experience their new employee had while regulating their industry. Federal U.S. environmental policy arises from the three branches of U.S. government: legislative, executive, and judicial. In brief, Congress, comprised of the Senate and the House of Representatives, creates legislation, also called statutory law. Once a law is enacted, it is implemented and enforced by an administrative agency within the executive branch. Administrative agencies are sometimes called the fourth branch. They create a great deal of policy through the form of regulations, which are specific rules or requirements designed to execute the objectives of the legislation passed by Congress. This shows a list of the many administrative agencies that influence governmental policy through the regulations they establish. The judicial branch, which consists of the Supreme Court and lower courts, interprets legislation. The U.S. can be used as a case study for studying environmental policy in developed democratic nations for several reasons. First, the U.S. pioneered innovative environmental policy. Second, the U.S. can be a model for both environmental successes and failures. Third, the U.S. is a very influential nation on the world stage. And finally, understanding environmental policy on the federal level is a good foundation for understanding policy on local, state, and international levels. The U.S. has gone through three distinct phases of environmental policy. The first phase was between the 1780s and the late 1800s, the same time that the U.S. was going through westward expansion. Key pieces of environmental legislation that were passed during this phase were the Homestead Act of 1862, which promoted land developed by allowing citizens to claim land to cultivate or build a home for a relatively low fee. The General Mining Act of 1872, which legalized and promoted mining by private citizens on public lands with no government oversight. The Timber Culture Act of 1873, which granted 160 acres to any citizen who pledged to cultivate trees for the timber industry on just 1/4 of the area provided to them. During this phase of U.S. history, millions of Native Americans were killed or displaced from their lands, as pioneers and other Americans pushed westward to claim and develop land they saw as undeveloped and rife with resources that appeared vast and inexhaustible. In short, this phase of U.S. environmental policy promoted settlement and natural resource extraction. The second phase of U.S. environmental policy occurred in the late 1800s and was largely in response to the destructive nature of the first wave. As such, the second wave promoted environmental conservation. The public and governmental focus shifted from environmental exploitation to conservation and preservation. Lands were passed to mitigate some of the harmful effects of westward expansion and the environmental policies of that era. Some key events that happened during this phase of U.S. environmental policy were creation of the National Park System, with Yellowstone being the world's first national park, creation of forest reserves and subsequently the National Forest System, creation of the first National Wildlife Refuge System by President Teddy Roosevelt in 1903. These three systems, forest, park, and wildlife refuge, still stand as global models of preservation and conservation. Land and soil conservation and management policies also improved during this era in response to the Great Dust Bowl and the Wilderness Preservation Act of 1964. The third wave of U.S. environmental policy began in the 1960s and continues through to our day. During this era of policy, the public became much more aware of pollution and the effects human activities have on the environment. Several events triggered this increased awareness. The first was the book Silent Spring, written by scientist and writer Rachel Carson. Her book documented the effects of pesticide pollution and awakened the public to the environmental and human health effects caused by exposure to pesticides and industrial chemicals. This is one of my favorite books in the field of environmental science for both its historical and environmental significance. Rachel Carson's work has had a profound effect on my life and career, and I highly encourage every student of environmental science to read her book. Another event that drew public attention to the pollution problems in the U.S. faced in the 1950s and 60s was the fire that burned on Ohio's Cuyahoga River in 1969. At the time, the Cuyahoga was so polluted with oil and industrial waste because there were no water regulations at the time that the river actually caught fire and burned for days. In response to these and several other events, the Earth Day movement began with the inaugural Earth Day in 1970. The purpose of this event was to rally public support for governmental action to reduce environmental pollution. The third wave of U.S. environmental policy saw the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, abbreviated EPA, and the creation of key environmental legislation such as the National Environmental Policy Act, abbreviated NEPA, the Clean Water Act, and the Clean Air Act. The creation of the EPA by President Richard Nixon in 1970 marked a shift in environmental policy and ushered in an agency charged with regulating water quality, air quality, solid waste, and other environmental issues. With the creation of the EPA came other key environmental protection laws: the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Toxic Substances Control Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the Soil and Water Conservation Act, and the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, abbreviated CERCLA and pronounced CERCLA. You should understand the basics of each of these. The Clean Air Act sets standards for air quality and imposes caps on emissions for a variety of known air pollutants. This act also enables citizens to sue polluters who violate this law, funds research for pollution control, and establish the cap-and-trade program for sulfur dioxide. The Endangered Species Act establishes rules to protect species which are in danger of extinction. Under the Endangered Species Act, it is illegal to kill or harm a listed species or its habitat on public or private land, and the Act provides funding for endangered species recovering efforts. The Safe Drinking Water Act authorized the EPA to set standards for the quality of drinking water provided to citizens through tap water. The Act also provides funds to help states protect drinking water resources from contamination. The Toxic Substances Control Act, abbreviated TSCA and pronounced TSCA, authorizes the EPA to monitor and regulate industrial chemicals manufactured or imported into the U.S., and to ban them if the risks to human and environmental health are found to be too great. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, abbreviated RCRA, and pronounced RCRA, is the Cradle to the Grave Act. This act requires that hazardous waste be monitored and regulated as it is created, transported, and disposed of. The Clean Water Act, which was originally termed the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, regulates discharges of waste into rivers and streams through a system of permits. The Soil and Water Conservation Act directs the U.S. Department of Agriculture to survey and assess soil and water conditions throughout the nation periodically and develop plans for conservation of both soil and water resources. Finally, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, abbreviated CERCLA and pronounced CERCLA, sometimes called the Superfund Law, provides a funded program to clean up the nation's polluted sites. Such sites are called Superfund sites and are placed on what is called the National Priorities List. While this program is a great idea, in practicality, there are not enough funds or personnel to clean up all the Superfund sites in the U.S. As of November 29, 2016, there were 1,337 sites on the National Priority List. That concludes the mini lecture on environmental policy. Please review the weekly outline and complete the activities for this week per the schedule set forth in the outline. Thanks and gig 'em!